No, the strongest.
Strongest man, just in terms of...
Earnie Shavers.
Really?
Yeah, man. Stronger than Joe Frazier and George Foreman. He hit hard. He's got the hit on his record.
You know, Ali is so cunning. I don't know if he's faking or what. You know, so I didn't want to move in for the kill and get killed, so I just played the caution and didn't go in. I let him off. Larry had one of the best jabs I ever fought against. I think he was very stiff, very fast, and good combination puncher. Larry could punch, you know, pretty good with the right hand, too. Very good fight. Underestimated, but a lot of people underestimated him, but a very good fighter.
Right. I got hit by Earnie Shavers, the hardest puncher that ever, I thought, hit anybody. I still got the knot right here 40 years later.
Earnie Shavers names 5 boxers he feared the most, and what he reveals will change how you see the hardest puncher in boxing history. The man they called the Black Destroyer, the fighter who hit so hard that Muhammad Ali said it shook his kinfolk back in Africa, was himself afraid. But this isn't a story about weakness. This is a story about respect, about what happens when unstoppable force meets immovable will, and about 5 men who refused to fall even when physics said they should. These weren't the men Shavers hated, they were the men he feared, and in boxing, that word means something entirely different. To understand why Shavers feared anyone, you have to understand what made him special. Earnie Shavers wasn't just a hard puncher, he was the hard puncher. With 74 wins and 68 knockouts, his fists weren't athletic tools, they were weapons. Larry Holmes once said that Shavers hit him harder than any other fighter, including Mike Tyson. When Shavers connected, opponents didn't just get hurt, they heard saxophones. They saw relatives in distant countries. They questioned reality itself. But here's the thing about being the most dangerous man in the room. When your entire identity is built on ending fights with one punch, what happens when that punch doesn't work? For a power puncher, fear isn't about pain. It's about ineffectiveness. It's about landing your best shot and watching your opponent smile back at you. That's the nightmare that haunted Earnie Shavers, and 5 men made that nightmare real. The first man on that list is Muhammad Ali, and if you think this is just about Ali being Ali, you're missing the deeper story. By September 1977, when Shavers finally got his title shot, Ali was 35 years old. He wasn't the dancing, floating butterfly anymore. He was slower, heavier, more human. But what Ali lost in speed, he gained in psychological warfare. Ali understood that Shavers was a confidence fighter, someone who thrived on early knockouts and the visible fear in his opponent's eyes. So Ali did what Ali did best. He got inside Shavers' head before the first bell ever rang. He started calling Shavers the Acorn, mocking his bald head, turning the Black Destroyer into something small and harmless. This wasn't trash talk for entertainment. This was tactical dismantling. Ali had this way of staring into fighters' eyes during face-offs, searching for any flicker of doubt, any crack in the armor. For Shavers, a man who grew up in the rural South and relied on physical dominance to command respect, Ali's mental impenetrability was terrifying. Ali didn't just fight bodies, he fought minds. Then came the actual fight at Madison Square Garden, and it became a 15-round war that tested everything Shavers believed about himself. In the second round, Shavers landed the shot. He caught Ali with a looping right hand that buckled the champion's legs and glazed his eyes. For any normal fighter, that would have been the end. But Ali stayed up. More than that, Ali played possum, feigning injury just enough to bait Shavers into overcommitting, then snapping back with those viper jabs. Every time Shavers threw his maximum effort punch and Ali remained standing, Shavers' doubt grew. Was Ali hurt? Was this a trap? The ambiguity was maddening. And then came the 15th round, the one that boxing historians still talk about as one of Ali's finest moments. Both men were exhausted. Shavers had thrown everything he had for 14 rounds. Logic said Ali should be done. Instead, Ali came out and attacked. He unleashed a barrage of combinations that nearly knocked Shavers out in the final seconds. Angelo Dundee, Ali's trainer, said those were as good as any 3 minutes Ali ever fought. For Shavers, that moment crystallized the fear. After 42 minutes of combat, after absorbing punches that would hospitalize normal humans, Ali still had more in the tank. The man simply had no breaking point. After the fight, Ali gave Shavers the quote that would define both their legacies. Ali said, "Earnie hit me so hard, it shook my kinfolk back in Africa." On the surface, it validated Shavers as the hardest hitter alive. But think deeper. That was how hard Shavers had to hit just to survive the experience. The mutual respect was real, but so was the fear. Ali admitted Shavers hit harder than Joe Frazier or George Foreman, but Shavers left that ring knowing he had landed his best and it wasn't enough. Against Ali, brute force couldn't solve the puzzle. You needed a spirit as deep as the ocean, and Ali's spirit was bottomless. If you're realizing right now that the hardest puncher in history had to deal with opponents who simply refused to respect the laws of physics, drop a comment below about which fighter you think had the toughest chin in boxing history, and make sure you subscribe because we're just getting started with this list. The second man Shavers feared was Larry Holmes, and this fear was different. With Ali, it was about mental dominance and durability. With Holmes, it was about technical perfection and something even more terrifying: the ability to come back from the dead. Shavers and Holmes fought twice, first in 1978 and then for the WBC Heavyweight Championship in 1979. Shavers openly admitted he feared Holmes' jab, and if you know boxing, you understand why. The jab is the weapon that controls distance, disrupts rhythm, and sets up everything else. Larry Holmes had arguably the best jab in boxing history. It wasn't a flicking, stinging jab. It was a piston that did real damage, that snapped heads back, swelled eyes shut, and made opponents second-guess every movement. For a power puncher like Shavers, the jab was a wall he couldn't break through. Holmes would hit him at will while staying just out of range of that devastating right hand. Every time Shavers tried to set his feet to throw, a gloved fist was already in his face. The accumulation of that punishment, round after round, created a helplessness worse than any knockout. But the moment that defines Shavers' fear of Holmes happened in the 7th round of their 1979 fight at Caesar's Palace. Shavers saw an opening and threw what witnesses described as one of the hardest punches in heavyweight history, an overhand right that traveled in a perfect arc and landed flush on Holmes' jaw. The sound was like a shotgun blast. Holmes crashed to the canvas, limbs sprawling, head bouncing off the mat. For one beautiful second, Shavers believed he was the heavyweight champion of the world. The crowd roared. The impossible had happened. And then Holmes got up. Not slowly, not stumbling. He got up. Holmes later described the experience in surreal terms. He said the punch made him hear saxophonist Jimmy Tillis, that his body felt stuck in watery jello, but his mind came back with crystal clarity. For Shavers, watching Holmes rise from the dead shattered something fundamental. This was the puncher's greatest fear realized. I have done my worst, I have landed the perfect shot, and he is still standing. Holmes didn't just get up. He recovered and eventually stopped Shavers in the 11th round. The fear Holmes instilled wasn't about his boxing skills, though those were elite. It was about his heart. Holmes proved that human will could override physical trauma. Shavers had to live with the knowledge that his power, his greatest gift, was insufficient against Holmes' refusal to quit. The third fighter on the list was Ron Lyle, and this is where we move from technical fear to primal fear. The fear of a man who has already died and come back. Ron Lyle wasn't an Olympian or a Golden Gloves champion. He was a product of the Colorado State Penitentiary, convicted of second-degree murder at 19, spending over 7 years behind bars. Prison wasn't just time served for Lyle, it was where he was forged. During his incarceration, he was stabbed by another inmate and lost 35 pints of blood on the operating table. He technically died twice before being revived. He survived through pure will, and during his recovery in solitary confinement, he did thousands of push-ups and visualized becoming heavyweight champion. Shavers knew this history. He knew he was facing someone with a detached stoicism, someone who didn't fear pain because pain was a language he already spoke fluently. You can't intimidate a man who has bled to death on a prison floor and woken up anyway. When Shavers and Lyle fought on September 13, 1975 in Denver, it wasn't boxing. It was mutual destruction. Lyle's strategy was terrifyingly simple. He invited opponents to throw their biggest punches so he could counter. Against Shavers, this was Russian roulette with a loaded gun. Lyle welcomed the nuclear bombs just to land his own. The fight was short and savage. Shavers dropped Lyle. Lyle dropped Shavers. Defense was abandoned for pure attrition. Lyle himself admitted, "That's the hardest I've ever been hit in my life. When he hit you, the lights went out." But Lyle refused to stay hurt. He got up and kept coming. Eventually, Lyle stopped Shavers in the 6th round, and there's a photo of Lyle scowling at the fallen Shavers after bludgeoning him to the canvas. That word, bludgeoned, captures what happened. This wasn't technical dismantling, this was a beating. While Ali and Holmes outboxed Shavers, Lyle outfought him. He walked through the fire and burned the arsonist. For Shavers, the fear of Lyle was the recognition of a superior alpha male in the domain of pure violence. The fourth name might surprise people because Jerry Quarry is often forgotten in discussions of 1970s heavyweights, overshadowed by the Ali, Frazier, Foreman triumvirate. But for Shavers, Quarry represented a specific and acute fear. The fear of being figured out. Quarry was often dismissed as a great white hope, a label that obscured his actual skill. In reality, Quarry was a technician with excellent fundamentals, a granite chin, and high ring intelligence. He had fought Patterson, Ali, and Frazier. He wasn't intimidated by reputations. Shavers respected Quarry's smarts. For a fighter who relied on overwhelming opponents and forcing panic-induced errors, a smart fighter who refused to panic was a dangerous puzzle. Quarry didn't run. He waited. On December 14, 1973 at Madison Square Garden, Shavers entered the ring on a 33-fight win streak with 32 knockouts. He was the terrifying force everyone avoided. Then Jerry Quarry completely demolished him in a little over 2 minutes. First round technical knockout. Corey neutralized Shavers' power not by running, but by attacking with precision. He slipped Shavers' jabs and countered with a rhythm Shavers couldn't track. After the fight, Shavers admitted, "Jerry caught me with a hard punch. He's a great fighter." The fear Corey instilled was intellectual. He proved that power without delivery was useless against a tough, smart opponent. Corey represented the ceiling Shavers couldn't break through, the test he couldn't study for. A fighter who saw punches before they were thrown. The loss was a psychological blow because it happened when Shavers was considered the most dangerous man in the division. The fifth name is complicated because, unlike the others, Shavers actually knocked out Ken Norton in the first round in 1979. But fear in boxing is often anticipatory. It's the dread of what might happen. Ken Norton was the man who broke Muhammad Ali's jaw. He was sculpted like a Greek god, fought Ali 3 times, and gave him absolute hell. For Shavers, Norton represented the gatekeeper to immortality. A win meant a title shot. A loss meant obscurity. The day before their fight, Norton received an envelope containing what he described as a one-way ticket back to Africa. The atmosphere was thick with racial tension and death threats, creating a pressure cooker for both men. Shavers' preparation was driven by fear. The fear that if he didn't end it early, Norton would drag him into deep waters like he did with Ali and Holmes. Norton's awkward cross-arm defense and mauling ability made him a nightmare matchup. To prepare, Shavers had to be in the best shape of his life. The stress of training camp, knowing Norton had given Ali fits 3 times, built enormous tension. When the fight happened, Shavers destroyed Norton in the first round. But Norton remains on this list not because of damage inflicted, but because of the sleepless nights he caused. The victory was so explosive precisely because the anxiety was so high. It was a release of weeks of fear. Norton earned Shavers' respect through reputation and the magnitude of the moment. Looking at these 5 fighters together reveals a pattern. Ali represented psychological durability. Holmes represented regenerative capacity. Lyle represented existential violence. Quarry represented tactical nullification. Norton represented anticipatory stress. What Shavers feared wasn't pain. It was the realization that his hammer couldn't bend certain nails. When you build your identity on ending fights with one punch, and someone takes that punch and smiles, your entire existence comes into question. This is what Ali meant when he said Shavers shook his kinfolk. It was validation of power, but for Shavers, it was a reminder that it wasn't enough. These 5 men represented walls the Black Destroyer couldn't break down. In admitting these fears, Shavers validated the greatness of the 1970s heavyweight era. It was a time when the hardest puncher in history could hit someone with the force of a freight train, watch them get up, and feel terror run down his spine. What makes this list even more fascinating is what it tells us about the heavyweight division in the 1970s. This wasn't an era of carefully protected records and cherry-picked opponents. This was a Shark Tank where the baseline requirement for survival was granite chins, ferocious brawling ability, and technical brilliance all rolled into one package. Shavers operated in what's called the golden age of heavyweights. And these 5 men represented different dimensions of that greatness. Each one brought something unique to the table that exposed a different vulnerability in Shavers' game. There were other fighters who earned honorable mentions in Shavers' mind. Randall Tex Cobb famously said, "If anybody hit harder than Shavers, I'd shoot him." Shavers pounded Cobb relentlessly, but Cobb simply would not drop. He represented that Homer Simpson syndrome, the opponent too tough to fall, which reinforced the frustration Shavers often felt. Then there was George Foreman, who Shavers never fought, but the connection through Ron Lyle created a triangle of mutual respect. Foreman admitted Lyle was the toughest opponent he ever faced, which says volumes about the caliber of competition in that era. The thing about Shavers naming these 5 specific fighters is that it reveals his self-awareness. He understood his own limitations. He knew that his right hand, as devastating as it was, couldn't solve every puzzle. Against Ali, he needed better conditioning and mental fortitude. Against Holmes, he needed a way to get past that jab and prevent the resurrection. Against Lyle, he needed to match that prison yard toughness. Against Quarry, he needed better defense and ring intelligence. Against Norton, he needed to manage the psychological pressure of high-stakes moments. Each fighter taught Shavers something about himself, and rather than hide from those lessons, he openly acknowledged them. That's the mark of a true champion mindset, even if the championship itself remained just out of reach. The 1970s heavyweight division was special because everyone fought everyone. There was no avoiding the top contenders. You either proved yourself or you got exposed. Shavers proved himself 74 times with 68 knockouts. But he also got exposed by these 5 men who possessed qualities that neutralized his ultimate weapon. In the modern era of boxing, where fighters often protect their records and avoid dangerous matchups, Shavers' willingness to name his fears and respect his conquerors feels refreshing and authentic. The legacy of Earnie Shavers is defined not just by the 68 men he knocked out, but by the 5 who looked into the cannon's mouth and refused to blink. In their survival, they proved their greatness. In his respect for them, Shavers proved his humanity. He wasn't a mindless destroyer. He was a man acutely aware of the dangers of his trade, honest enough to name the fighters who made him question everything he believed about power. That honesty, that vulnerability, makes his legend even greater. Because true strength isn't pretending you're invincible. True strength is facing your fears and stepping into the ring anyway, knowing that on any given night, you might meet someone who simply will not fall. Shavers met 5 of those men, and boxing history is richer for it. If this story changed how you see one of boxing's most feared punchers, leave a comment about which of these 5 fighters impressed you most and subscribe, because the golden age of heavyweights has stories that will never get old.